The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started right at 1 o'clock. Good afternoon and welcome to the Grant Administration Training for Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Management Grantees, sponsored by the DNR and UW-Madison Division of Extension. My name is Whitney Presby. I'm a natural resources educator in Green Bay. I'm joined by my colleague Michelle Scarpace, who is a natural resources educator in Madison. I'd like to welcome Corinne Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager, who will be presenting today. UW Extension has partnered with the DNR for more than 9 years, bringing relevant information to a variety of natural resource, municipal, and other local government professionals. And we're happy to be here today with all of you. Just going to go over a few of the webinar logistics. So your control panel, if you'd like to hide that or expand the control panel, just simply click on the orange box in the upper left-hand corner. If you have any issues with your audio throughout the call, you're able to click on the audio drop-down box and switch to phone call, and that will give you the information that you need to be able to dial in from a landline or your cell phone. If you have questions throughout the webinar today, please enter them in the questions drop-down bar. You can ask us if you have any issues with your technology or if you have questions about the content. Corinne will be taking questions periodically throughout the webinar. Questions that are applicable to the whole group we'll address in the webinar. If you have a very specific project question, we will follow up with you individually. And I'd just like to let you know that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube, and you'll be receiving an email with that link in the coming days. So with that, I will turn it over to Corinne.
Excellent. All right, let's dive in. Let me minimize my GoToMeeting toolbar there. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the Urban Nonpoint Source Planning Grant Administration webinar. As Whitney mentioned, I am Corinne Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager. Some of you may know me from my past position at the department. I was formerly the Nonpoint Source Program Coordinator in Runoff Management. But now, again, I am the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager in the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. I want to congratulate everyone again for having been awarded an Urban Nonpoint Source Planning Grant. And we are excited to provide you with information that we hope is going to help you in administering your grant through its life cycle. Today, we're going to try to answer frequently asked questions and provide tips on how to avoid common errors and problems before they arise. Ultimately trying to prevent delays in processing your reimbursement requests for your grant. So now that you've been awarded a grant, we're going to run through some of the key steps in the grant process, specifically the grant agreement, the PSA approval process, the reimbursement request, amendments and variances, and the final report. Please remember, as Whitney said, this webinar is being recorded so that you can reference back to it if you need to through the life cycle of your grant. Ultimately, we really want to try to make the grant administration process as easy as possible for you. So the first step in the grant administration process is the grant award, or the grant agreement. And thankfully, all of you have received, signed, and returned your grant agreement document, which is fantastic. And if you haven't already read your grant document thoroughly, I encourage you to do so because it serves as the foundation for your grant implementation and your funding eligibility. And should you have any further questions after today's presentation, we have 8 regional Nonpoint Source coordinators in the state, along with staff here in Madison to help you out. Your regional Nonpoint Source coordinator is your primary point of contact. You should have already made contact with them during the grant application process, so hopefully this isn't new information for you. But they are all supported then, like I said, by staff here in Madison. And again, here's a map of our regional Nonpoint Source coordinators' county assignments. So take note of your county and your associated coordinator. So before you really start to dive into your project, we want to make you aware of an approval step, a pre-approval that is necessary for your project, and that is what we refer to as the PSA approval. So Urban Nonpoint Source Planning grants require approval of the professional service agreements, or PSAs. PSAs must be pre-approved by DNR and cannot be approved after the fact. The requirement for these approvals is established in Chapter NR 155, which is the guiding administrative code for the Urban Nonpoint Source program, and it is reiterated in your grant conditions. And this applies to anything reimbursed by the grant, except work done by the grantee's own in-house staff. And I want to also point out too that this does not just pertain to hiring a for-profit consultant. It also applies to contract employees, university or other public agency services that are provided as part of your project. So when you get your PSA approval, it's going to be an actual letter on DNR letterhead, and it will reference the project name and grant number and will be signed by the DNR Regional Nonpoint Source Coordinator. The letter may be sent to you via email as an attachment. However, just an email message or verbal approval does not meet the program requirements. You need a letter that looks like this particular one, for your records and for our records to be able to process a reimbursement request. So let's zoom in a little further and see what's included in the approval. So first off, the letter identifies the PSA that is approved. Then the letter identifies the required planning deliverables associated with the approved PSA. Next, the letter identifies the scope elements of the PSA that are approved for cost sharing. And you'll see that the number on the left side of the table identifies the required planning deliverable associated with each eligible planning activity in the PSA. And so why are these PSA activities tied to the planning deliverables? Well, it's because the planning activities are only eligible for reimbursement if they are produced, if they produce a required approved deliverable. So for example, developing an ordinance is only eligible if the ordinance is produced. Meetings to discuss revisions or reviewing an existing ordinance to see if it needs updates are eligible activities, but only if an acceptable ordinance is produced. If the PSA doesn't include final deliverables, then the grantee is responsible for producing those deliverables. They are not excused from it because it wasn't included in the PSA. The next column shows the total amount of each scope item that would be eligible for cost sharing. And then in the last column to the right-hand side is the maximum amount that can be reimbursed by the state for each item in the PSA. And then next, towards the bottom of the letter, you'll see the conditions of approval. I think first and foremost, it's important to point out that changes in the contract scope require prior written approval from DNR to be eligible for reimbursement. If your project changes and changes are not submitted for approval, you may get to the end of the project and find your project is not reimbursable. If one or more grant deliverables are not completed, grant reimbursement may not exceed the state cost share for completed deliverables itemized above. So if you fail to provide one or more approved deliverables, then the value of the scope items associated with that deliverable are deducted from the award amount. And then lastly, the letter must be signed by your DNR Regional Nonpoint Source Coordinator. An email message or verbal approval over the phone does not constitute a PSA approval. And I just want to provide some additional clarifications. A lot of these clarifications come from real-world experiences with Urban Nonpoint Source planning grants and questions that we've received over the years regarding project deliverables. So I'll just point out here that reviewing and recommending changes to existing ordinances or stormwater programs or plans is not eligible for reimbursement if the required final deliverable is not provided. As I mentioned before, as in the example, reviewing existing ordinances or programs or plans and determining that no change or changes are required is also not eligible for reimbursement. An ordinance and a plan are different deliverables. Specifically, an ordinance is a piece of legislation enacted by a municipal authority, and a plan is a detailed formulation of a program of action. So as such, an ordinance is not an acceptable plan development deliverable, and a plan is not an acceptable ordinance development deliverable. And then last on this slide, you'll note that eligible expenses associated with developing or updating a local illicit discharge program do not include costs associated with outfall inspection and monitoring. And we have a few more points of clarification. Participating in meetings is only eligible for reimbursement if the meetings are directly related to the development of deliverables funded by this grant. Documentation of the meeting date, location, topic, associated eligible deliverables, and participants requesting reimbursement for their time is required. A stormwater quality management plan should include cost estimates for construction of the BMPs evaluated by the plan and identify sources of funding to construct said BMPs. This element of a stormwater quality management plan is not the same as evaluating financial alternatives for funding a stormwater quality management program. And group membership fees, such as some local stormwater groups or consortiums, those too are not an eligible reimbursement expense. Planning deliverables should be developed according to DNR guidance unless the grantee has received prior approval from the regional stormwater engineer to use an alternative approach needed or determined to be equivalent. So why should you care so much about this whole PSA approval process, and why are we spending so much time on it? It really is a critical step for you as the grantee, because ultimately it's the grantee who pays for the project and requests reimbursement from the DNR. So therefore, it's important that the grantee has the resources needed to complete the project so that it is eligible for reimbursement. And this means that either the grantee has the resources to take what is provided by the consultant and develop it further to meet the grant requirements, or that the grantee has agreements in place that will result in deliverables that meet requirements of the grant agreement and can be reimbursed. So if planning activities undertaken under this grant program don't provide required deliverables, or if the required deliverables don't meet DNR requirements, it's still the grantee's responsibility to provide those deliverables in order to get reimbursed. And just want to point out too that, really the benefit here is that the PSA approval is an opportunity for DNR to help the grantees make sure that what they are undertaking will meet the grant reimbursement requirements. That's really what we're ultimately hoping for here, is to ensure that you actually get the grant funds and are developing a worthy project. So at this point right now, I'll just pause before we move on to section 3 for the reimbursement request. Does anybody have any questions, Whitney, that you think are worthy for the group to hear?
Yeah, there's one question that came in. It says, if there are grant funds remaining after all PSA tasks are completed, can grantees add additional tasks such as SLAM modeling or BMP improvement alternatives to utilize the remaining grant award?
I believe so. I think you'd have to request a scope amendment. You'd have to request a grant amendment for those things. And we have certain criteria that we use. I'm going to go through amendments a little bit later on in the presentation. But you would have to request a grant amendment, essentially. You'd be kind of modifying the scope of your project. And we would have to move funding, any of that underspending between budget lines for the planning deliverables in your grant. But it would have to be kind of evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But yes, the door would be open to that, as long as it's something that's kind of consistent with the goals of your project and meets our evaluation criteria for a grant amendment.
All right, that's the only question we have right now.
All right. All right, well, then we'll move on to section 3, which is the reimbursement request. Probably everyone's favorite and probably the most important part of the grant process here. And so in this section, we're going to go through the procedures to fill out the reimbursement request form, which is DNR form 8700-336. We'll provide some examples and also some helpful hints on how to fill out the form. So why is it important to provide all of the required information in a reimbursement request? This is a frequently asked question. For us at DNR in the grant program management realm, we really, all of us, frankly, grantees and the grantor have a obligation to tell the story on how the state money was spent, and that it was spent consistent with applicable rules and statutes and funding requirements. And it helps DNR meet any reporting requirements that we may have and audit requirements for the grant program. And it really helps essentially tell the story then too of what was accomplished via these grant funds. And then when may I request reimbursement? For planning grantees, you may request a partial reimbursement request whenever costs have been incurred. That's different than, say, an Urban Nonpoint Source construction grant, where you need to essentially fully implement or construct a BMP in order to seek reimbursement. But when you provide a partial reimbursement request for your planning project, you will be expected to provide a progress report as part of that reimbursement form, outlining what you've accomplished so far on the project. Final reimbursement requests must be submitted within 60 days of the end of the grant period, which is generally March 1st of any given year, following the grant expiration date in most cases. And just one thing I want to point out is when you seek a partial reimbursement for a planning project, 50% of that reimbursement will be withheld until the final reimbursement can be paid. And when we have documentation essentially that the project deliverables have been approved. So just keep that in mind. So when you're completing your reimbursement form, really start out by making sure that you're providing information that is consistent with the grant agreement. Like I said, that grant agreement serves as kind of your foundational document, and we want to ensure that we've got the same kind of information coming through the grant process, from the grant agreement to the reimbursement request to the final report form that we're going to cover later in the webinar. So it's a kind of a common mistake that we see, is that there's inconsistent information provided throughout the process, and that can really slow things down. So just try to keep the information consistent through these various forms. Always download the most current version of the reimbursement form from the Urban Nonpoint Source Grant Program website, which is provided here. And try not to rely on previously used reimbursement forms, because we do make updates and edits to that form periodically to try to make it easier to use, or if grant program components change, we may have to revise the form. So please always go back to the grant website to get the most updated version of the form. And there's also instructions and a checklist on the Urban Nonpoint Source grant site website for your use to help you in filling out the reimbursement form. So now we're going to look at the form in more detail. So what you see here is the kind of the general grant information section. That contains information that identifies the grantee name and the address for where reimbursement checks should be mailed. Lists the project name, the unique grant award number that we assigned your project, the applicable state cost share rate, which for many projects is 50%. In some cases, you may have accepted a lower cost share rate. And then also the pay request number. If this is your first grant or reimbursement request, it would be pay request number 1. And then last but not least on this form or this part of the form, the grantee should indicate whether this is a partial or a final request, the program type. Obviously, in your case, it's going to be an Urban Nonpoint Source Planning Grant, the time period covered by the request, and for final request, just keep in mind that you're also going to have to provide a complete and completed final report form, which must be approved by DNR stormwater engineering staff and the regional non-point source coordinator before the final reimbursement is processed. So in terms of page 1 of the reimbursement form, we have a few tips for creating a successful reimbursement request. Again, download that most up-to-date version of the form. And when you're putting in your cost share rate, again, make sure you take that from the grant agreement. Keep that information consistent through the process. And when you're putting your grant information please provide that same grant information that you used and submitted to the department for your contact page that was provided with your grant agreement. We really want to try to keep the address and the contact information for where to send the reimbursement to consistent through the process. And then for the period covered by the request, it must be within the grant period and within the date range of the invoices that you're providing. So if an invoice is dated, as an example, January 15th, 2020, and this is when the contractor invoiced the grantee. Let's say this was a grant that expired last year. It's okay that the invoice came in after the grant closed, but you have to at least provide some documentation to show when the work was conducted, and that needs to be within the grant period. So make sure that that invoice, that proof of purchase documentation, shows exactly when the work was done and that was within your grant period. So continuing down to the payment information section on page 1 of the reimbursement form. This is in the middle of the form on page 1. You're going to be providing a summary of the current payment record and grant balance. The grant financial data includes the total grant award, payments the grantee has received to date, and grant funds remaining. So the blue highlighted lines are where the grantee must enter their grant award amount, which is listed on your grant agreement again, and total prior reimbursement amounts. The pink cell in row 2A, containing the reimbursement request total, is actually auto-populated from table 1 on the next page of the reimbursement form and cannot be overwritten. The green grant balance remaining amount is auto-populated as well based on the amounts that you entered above, further up in the table. And then last, the highlighted yellow cells in the right-hand column are for DNR use, so you don't have to put anything in those cells, just leave them blank. And then on page 1, down near the bottom of the form, is the certification section, and this is required to be completed by the grantee's authorized representative, certifying that the information contained in the form and the supporting documentation is true and correct. So your authorized government official must sign or type their name in the space provided. And if the name of the official is typed rather than signed, the official must personally email the completed reimbursement form and the supporting documentation to the regional non-point source coordinator. The authorized representative's job title and contact information must also be provided, as well as the date that the RFR or the reimbursement is submitted to DNR. And then last but not least, on that bottom of that page, again, is the CFA comments, the Community Financial Assistance Comments section, which is for DNR use only, and you can just leave those fields blank. And just a reminder about the authorized representative and the governmental responsibility resolutions. Thankfully, all of you have provided your resolutions, which was a condition essentially of receiving your grant award, so that's great. In future updates of your resolutions, just keep in mind that it's always preferred that the position title of the authorized representative be listed rather than a person's name, because people do change their jobs. And this position title for the RFR must be spelled out for you to be able to receive reimbursement. So we'll be looking at your resolution and comparing who was authorized there to the name that's actually on the reimbursement form. And just know that we do have a sample resolution on as a Word document on the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website for future reference if you need to make, you feel like you need to make changes to your resolution. So moving on to page 2 of the reimbursement request form, you'll see tables 1 and 2. And the next several slides are going to go through how to complete both of those tables in terms of what is needed and trying to ensure that you provide an accurate request and that we can process that reimbursement as quickly as possible. So for table 1, I just want to remind everybody that planning activities are treated as essentially as best management practices or BMPs on the reimbursement form. So when you think BMP, it's the activities that you're trying to do with your planning grants. So for each grant eligible planning activity for which you're seeking reimbursement, the following information must be provided. So we're going to go kind of across the table from left to right. The name of the cost share recipient, which in most cases is going to be you, the municipality, that is the grantee. The activity that was completed, and you can do this, you can start by doing this by using the drop-down box for the DNR BMP code, and then the number of units of that activity that was completed, the total expense amount, the reimbursement amount from the DNR, and whether or not the activity was completed in its entirety. Then it's a yes or no question. So let's move on to the actual steps of filling out that part or those parts of table 1. So you can see in the first column, you're probably going to be putting in your own municipal name, municipality's name as the cost share recipient. And then you're going to select the applicable BMP code for your planning activity. And so you will find, the eligible planning activities for your project, once again, in your grant agreement. So if you're wondering, well, what is U8? Be sure to go back and look at the BMP codes that were actually listed specifically in your grant agreement. So if you're doing a stormwater control ordinance, that's U12. If you're doing a plan, that's U8, and so on and so on. So if you don't see a certain planning activity in your grant that you thought you were receiving reimbursement for, you're going to need a grant amendment to add any additional activities to your grant project before they can be eligible for reimbursement. So just make sure you have that connection of starting with your grant agreement and making sure that activity is in that grant agreement. And we'll talk about grant amendments a little bit later on. And you can always ask your regional Nonpoint Source coordinator if you have any questions about that process. So for continuing to fill out table 1, we've got some tips for success in filling that out. First off, there needs to be a line in table 1 for each planning activity for which reimbursement is being requested. So, as stated before, if the grant application and grant agreement lists 3 activities, all 3 must be listed if work was completed for those activities. So, if you want to be reimbursed for a certain planning activity, you have to be able to list it here. And those activities cannot be combined in one line. They must be separated out. So for instance, if you are updating your stormwater management plan, you can't put all of the work for U8 stormwater plan if there are additional planning activities that need to be reimbursed. If you were, say, also doing an ordinance, you would have to separate those out like you see here. U8 and U9 are separate lines. So then third, the reimbursement request column must specify the amount that you essentially are seeking for reimbursement. The previous column to the left of that is the eligible state cost share amount that would be eligible, but perhaps you're not seeking that full amount in your reimbursement request for any variety of reasons. But the amount that you're ultimately seeking reimbursement for is in that yellow shaded section. And it's really helpful that, when you're providing your proofs of purchase, usually invoices, that you somehow on that document, whether it's already included in the invoice or you're writing it on the invoice, that you're writing the planning activities associated with that invoice. It really helps with clarifying that for review. It speeds up the process. And if only a portion of an invoice is being sought for reimbursement, putting those various reimbursement calculations in a separate spreadsheet is helpful. Really kind of parsing those out and pointing out very clearly which of those expenses is actually being sought for reimbursement if there's all kinds of other expenses on that invoice. So continuing on then with table 2, this is where each invoice or proof of purchase needs to be entered for each BMP or planning activity in this case. And additional rows can be added in this table by selecting the plus sign over on the far right-hand side of that table. So we'll further break down the components in table 2. So again, proofs of purchase are required for all state cost share amounts to be reimbursed. They can include accepted bids, accepted estimates, invoices, work orders, or contractual agreements. I think most common is that we see invoices coming in. If one proof of purchase contains costs for multiple planning activities, the proof of purchase should be listed multiple times for each activity. That allows us to be able to see the expenses documented in the proof of purchase and reconcile those with expenses that are then being claimed up in table 1 for each BMP. So the document number is generally the invoice number. If you don't have an invoice, please use the date on whatever document you've received. The BMP code must be selected from the drop-down as you did up in table 1. And the lines in table 2 for that BMP ultimately will total up to be the same BMP amount in table 1. The DNR funding amount is the reimbursement amount that is being requested. So for a given invoice and for a given practice, how much funding is actually being sought from DNR in that case. And then the blue highlighted section, you're going to put essentially the remainder of the expense that DNR is not funding in those cells. And then in the pink section, you're going to essentially write out or let us know what are the non-DNR funding sources. That section must be completed. It could be a landowner, it could be you, the municipality in that case, it could be from other funding sources or potentially other grant programs, but that section does in fact need to be completed. So continuing on with table 2, just want to point out that the total amounts of DNR and non-DNR funding, as well as a grand total amount, are calculated and auto-populated at the bottom of table 2. The proof of purchase documentation amounts in Table 2 should be reconciled with the costs claimed in Table 1. So we'll break that down a little bit further here. You'll see that the proof of purchase grand total amount in Table 2 should equal the total BMP expense claimed in Table 1. So in this case, the totals are both $90,000 in those yellow circles. The total DNR funding amount in Table 2 should equal the total reimbursement request amount in Table 1, as noted with the blue circles. And in that case, it is $59,400. So in this example of Table 1 and Table 2 that have been filled out, each BMP was listed and must have its associated invoices in Table 2. And so in Table 2, the BMP code needs to be selected for each proof of purchase document. And you can tell by the highlighting the corresponding invoices that go with the BMPs for which reimbursement is being sought up in Table 1. And just remember too, in Table 2, that each proof of purchase for which reimbursement is being requested needs to have a separate line in Table 2. And sometimes that invoice might be mentioned twice because it has 2 or more BMPs associated with it, or planning activities, I should say, in this case. So then the last section of the reimbursement request form is the project status and project installation verification sections. The project status box needs to be completed if a partial reimbursement request is being submitted. I mentioned that this is kind of like an interim report. And really what we're trying to do is gauge whether or not the project is on track or not. Project installation verification largely is more so for actual BMP construction or implementation. Typically that's populated by the grantee and the contact person certifying that the BMP was instructed. It's not quite as applicable for planning projects, but if you've reached kind of a milestone on your planning activities, you can go ahead and fill this out, but it's really more so for construction projects. And then the purple highlighted section is for the regional non-point source coordinator to fill out as they review your reimbursement request, and then ultimately are forwarding it on to me to process the reimbursement. So I'll pause here if anybody has any questions about anything that's been covered up to this point.
So we have one, it's more of a comment, but maybe you want to elaborate on this, Corinne. Says, I've seen problems with where a town or village will hand over the execution of the grant to a consultant. However, in the end, it turns out the consultant did not follow the DNR grant deliverables, and the village is on the hook for paying for that. It's vital that someone in the town or village pay close attention and check in regularly with the consultant on the progress and how closely it ties to the grant. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, that's a very good statement, and I think I know who provided that statement, so thank you. I think that that's really important to reiterate that, yes, the planning grant is between you, the municipality, and DNR. And you, the municipality, are receiving funds to provide certain planning deliverables. And yes, you are relying on a consultant in most cases to help provide those deliverables, but you are the grantee. So yes, it is really important, and that's why we spend so much time on the professional service agreement approval process, because that is the contract between you and the consultant to try to get the services that are necessary to provide the reimbursable deliverables. We really don't want to have situations, it's really unfortunate when there are situations where there's been some sort of disconnect between you and the consultant about what needs to be developed to be reimbursable. And Definitely keep in touch with your consultants, communicate on a regular basis, and touch base on the status of your projects, because again, the city, town, or village, whoever's our grantee, is the one that's on the hook for making sure that those deliverables are completed properly and within the grant period. Any other questions?
Nope, that's all we have right now.
All right. All right, moving along then. So next, with the grant process, we're going to talk about amendments and variances. You know, sometimes things change no matter how much you plan on your planning projects. Things can change during your grant period, and sometimes an amendment or a variance may be necessary during your project. So let's dive into those elements of the grant process. So what is a grant amendment? Really what it is a change to one or more conditions of your grant agreement. And when should you request an amendment? You definitely should request an amendment or a change to your grant agreement before the grant expires, before the end of your grant period. And definitely before taking any action or incurring any project costs that are inconsistent with your current grant agreement. There again, you know, it's really important for you to be familiar with your grant conditions in your grant agreement. This is some examples here, such as incurring project costs that are ineligible for cost sharing under the grant agreement, or are maybe in excess of the cost shareable amounts for any budget line in the grant agreement. Again, there are certain grant amounts that are budgeted for the deliverables, and you would need an amendment to be able to move the budget lines between those budget deliverables, those grant deliverables. Adding or eliminating a planning deliverable included in the grant agreement, and it gets back to the earlier question that we had about if some of your deliverables come in under budget and you've got money, you may be able to request an amendment to modify your project. But again, there are criteria for determining whether or not that change is going to be allowed or not to your project, especially if you're changing the location of your project planning area. You may remember that you receive certain points for where your project sits in the state and the water bodies in the area that's being impacted by your planning project. So let's cover the amendment types at this point. First one is a time amendment. This is probably the most common type of amendment request that we receive, and it extends the length of the grant period. NR 155, which is the guiding administrative code for urban non-point source grants, establishes that grant projects are for 2 years with the possible extension to a 3rd year. So extending the grant period from 2 to 3 years requires a grant amendment. The next category of amendment is a budget amendment. If a grantee wants to increase the state share amount for one or more budget lines in the grant, this is a budget amendment. In many cases, a budget amendment doesn't change the total award amount, but instead shifts money from one budget line to another within an agreement. The next type of an amendment is a scope amendment. This type of amendment is required if the grantee changes the planning deliverables, adding or eliminating them from the grant agreement. And sometimes other issues come up that require a change to the grant agreement conditions. It's nearly impossible for us to anticipate all of the reasons that may require an amendment. So keep in mind that any change in your grant conditions requires an amendment, even if it doesn't fall into the category of time, budget, or scope. An amendment is still required, and you should talk to your regional non-point source coordinator early about any changes. And also keep in mind that your grant application is incorporated into your grant agreement by reference. So ultimately, if a change to your project as described in your application is necessary, it may also require a grant amendment. So the amendment form, the amendment request form, again, is DNR form 8700-308, and it is on the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website, so you can find the form there. And the form provides kind of a line of questioning in parts A and B, and asks you questions about the proposed changes. So based on what you answer in parts A and B, the form will then tell you, the grantee, whether a budget, scope, or extension amendment is required. So on this slide, you can see that the grantee has filled out parts A and B, and part C tells the grantee that based on their answers, this is actually an urban construction example, that based on their answers that yes, an extension amendment and scope amendment are both required. So again, based on the type of amendment needed, subsequent questions will appear for the grantee to answer. So this is just kind of the beginning of the form. Once you kind of know what type of amendment you're going to need, there will be additional questions that you're going to need to answer to help us determine whether or not we can approve that amendment. And like I said, there's always circumstances that we can't anticipate and cover in the form. So please do talk to your regional non-point source coordinator if you think that there's going to be a change to your grant that's necessary. So once you complete the form, you're going to submit the form to your regional coordinator, who will review and forward it to our DNR non-point source grants team. It's a combination of runoff management and community financial assistance staff. And if the amendment is approved by the grants team, then I will issue the amendment to you. Time extension amendments are usually a letter from the DNR notifying you of the extension. And the other kinds of amendments generally require that the grantee signs and returns a grant amendment document to the DNR. Okay, so moving on to variances. An amendment is a change to the grant agreement, but what happens if something in your project changes and potentially that change is prohibited by the administrative code? Or more accurately, is it something that would require DNR to make an exception to the code? This change would essentially be that necessary would be called a variance. And NR 155 does provide the authority to make exceptions to the administrative code, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when is a variance allowed? Generally, when it's essential to affect the necessary grant actions and try to meet the water quality objectives of the project. And certainly, we're looking to see if a variance could be allowed when the circumstances that are special to your project are still in the best interest of the overall grant program. It's not something that kind of flies in the face of the intent of the program. When is a variance not allowed? It's definitely not allowed when the grant requirement is something that is specified in Wisconsin state statutes. We, DNR, are not allowed to issue any kind of variance from statutory requirements. Probably the most common type of variance that we see in the Urban Nonpoint Source grant programs, both construction and planning, is variance requests to extend the length of the grant period beyond the maximum allowed in NR 155. So the conditions under which we're allowed to make changes or exceptions to the administrative code, I shouldn't say changes to the exception, it's really truly exceptions to the administrative code, are established in NR 155.31. And there's certain things that the grantee needs to do, and there's certain things that the DNR needs to do. And so for the grantee, you're going to need to submit a written request to DNR requesting the variance, citing a specific section of the code or subsection from which the variance is requested. And you need to clearly explain the circumstances justifying the variance in the written request. And it should be addressing factors such as good cause or circumstances beyond the control of the grantee or potentially some sort of financial hardship. DNR, the DNR requirements are generally that the DNR grants team will review the request to determine, based on what you've provided in your written request, whether that's, again, essential to complete your grant actions and meet your project water quality objectives, and make sure that, again, it's in the best interest of the grant program as a whole. And ultimately, if it's approved, we will move forward and process that variance request. So the variance request language really is quite simple. And here's an example of some boilerplate language. You can see here in the highlighted sections where the grantee would need to provide certain information, again, their name, the code section for which you're seeking an exception via the variance, a description of the request and your grant number and the name of your grant, along with the justification for the request. And you can see a simple example here that kind of fills in that information for a particular project. And again, that justification language is really focused on addressing factors that are of good cause and kind of beyond the control of you as the grantee. So when is a variance request officially approved and in effect? I think it's really important to point out that you are going to receive a letter or grant amendment signed by the director of DNR's Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. No other bureau director is going to be issuing this. No other staff member is going to be issuing this approval. It is going to be coming from the Bureau Director of Community Financial Assistance. When is a variance not in effect? It's definitely not in effect when you have that email from the DNR staff person that they're essentially recommending approval of the request to the DNR grants team. So be looking for that official approval from the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. And it won't be official until you see a letter that looks something like this. And so again, it's going to be on DNR letterhead, and it's going to have the actual signature of the Bureau Director of Community Financial Assistance in order to be valid. So I'll pause here once again just to see if we have any questions about anything covered up to this point before we move to the final section on the final report.
There are no new questions.
Okay. All right, final report, last but not least. As I mentioned before, in order to get your final reimbursement, a final report form will need to be submitted. It is required for all Urban Nonpoint Source grants. It must be submitted within 60 days of the end of the grant period, which in most cases is right around this time of year, actually, around March 1st of the year following grant expiration. And it must be filled out completely, and it will be sent back if it's not, and that can delay your final reimbursement request from being processed if it's not filled out completely. And one thing I want to point out, since many of you won't be submitting your final report form for probably another couple of years, I just want to mention that we are working on developing an easier way to complete and submit the form. In the future, you will be able to enter your information into an online BMP implementation tracking system that DNR is developing, rather than filling out a PDF form. And it's possible that this new system will be up and running by the time you submit your final report for your project. However, Still today, we still need to rely on the fillable PDF forms that are on the DNR website, and we'll go through that form today. But just know that the BMP implementation tracking system that I've just mentioned, the requirements there for filling out the final report form will be exactly the same, essentially the same content requirements as the PDF form that we're going to go through right now. And so, as always, the final report form is on the Urban Nonpoint Source Grant website. The instructions are there too. Please read the instructions, and they'll provide good guidance on how to complete the form and get that form as complete as possible ultimately for that final reimbursement. All right, diving in then to the grant information. Really, this is pretty self-explanatory. Enter all the information listed in this section. Again, same as it appears on your grant agreement. So try to keep that information consistent from the grant agreement to the reimbursement request to the final report. So for your project location, you're going to enter all the information listed for the project location, consistent with the location and watershed information that's in your project application, or your most recent grant amendment if it happens to be different. So I just want to point out that we do geolocate all of our DNR grant projects, whether they're Urban Nonpoint Source grants or targeted runoff management grants, in our various web-based mapping tools. And so we'd like to have accurate information about your project locations. And you can use the DNR Surface Water Data Viewer, and I provided the link there to help you in defining this if you need it. Just want to remember that your nearest receiving water body is the stream, river, or lake that is in closest proximity to your project area. In some cases, it could be multiple water bodies, but really look for that nearest water body for your project. The primary water body is the water body for which credit was taken in the water quality needs section of your grant application. So in many cases, the primary water body could be a larger main stem in the main watershed for your project area in your municipality. And then if you could provide a brief description of that overall project area that's covered by the various planning activities that were part of your planning grant. And if you need additional project locations, they can be added by clicking on the plus button that's over in the far right side margin at the bottom of the site location table in the form. And then they're saved as they are completed. And you can see this in this diagram. You can use this information to help kind of gauge whether or not you feel like you have more than one project location. So kind of yes or no question sequence here. Is the entire project area located within one HUC 12? Yes or no? Is the entire project area located in the same municipality? Yes or no? Is the entire project area comprised of a single contiguous area? Yes or no? So in some cases, depending on how you answer those questions, you may find that you have multiple project locations that you're going to need to add into your one final report form. So moving on to your planning deliverables, this is essentially where you're telling the story of what your project accomplished. So for each of the planning, the applicable deliverable categories, ordinances, plans, financial analysis, and program development and implementation. In column 1, you're going to use the drop-down list in each of those various sections, whatever's applicable to your project, to select the deliverable that was developed by the planning project. In column 2, going from left to right, you're going to select developed new or updated existing from the drop-down menu, and to indicate whether it was a new planning product that was developed or an existing one that was updated. And then in column 3, kind of in the middle, you're going to enter the number of acres that was covered by that planning deliverable. An example for ordinance deliverables would be the number of acres that are covered by the deliverable being the size of the area, the municipal area where that particular ordinance applies. In the fourth column from the left, you're going to identify the name of the planning product that was developed or updated. For example, it could be something as specific as saying Chapter 27, Section 2, City of Smithville Code of Ordinances. And then in the bottom half of column 4, you can see that there's 2 rows in that column. You're going to explain the purpose or the results of that particular planning product in brief. And then in the 5th column, farthest to the right, you'll select yes or no from the drop-down menu to indicate whether that deliverable has been reviewed and approved by stormwater program staff here at DNR. And you're going to need to submit again that final report after all deliverables have been reviewed and approved by stormwater program staff. Grantees should really submit their deliverables to the DNR Regional Nonpoint Source Coordinator at least 60 days prior to grant expiration. So then the Nonpoint Source Coordinator can forward those deliverables to the appropriate stormwater program review staff. Please do not wait until the last day of your grant to submit your deliverables to the department. Alternatively, if a deliverable will be or has already been submitted to a stormwater program staff as part of an MS4 permit requirement, grantees should notify their regional DNR Nonpoint Source Coordinator of that submittal so that the Nonpoint Source Coordinator can make sure that all the necessary deliverables are routed for the necessary grant reviews. And the stormwater staff can be in communication then too with the Nonpoint Source Coordinator and vice versa. So for the performance standards addressed by the project, you're going to want to use the drop-down list to select the applicable stormwater performance standards that is addressed by the planning activities that you conducted as part of your project. You can add rows for additional standards by clicking the plus sign over at the right margin of the form. And then near the end of the form, there's a project comments section where you can provide any relevant information about the project and the deliverables that maybe wasn't asked for previously, including, providing a summary of any project challenges or accomplishments of the project, just shedding a little bit more light on your project if you so desire. And also, it's also a place to report on the status of your municipality's approval, adoption, and implementation of the planning deliverables, including ordinances developed under the grant. So for example, you might want to say that the updated erosion control ordinance was adopted by the village board on November 15th, 2021. And then there is a required attachments section that you can check the boxes for the things that are applicable to your final deliverables. And so just a reminder that if any of these check boxes apply to your project, it is going to be expected that you check the box and provide those things as attachments to your final report. So please check the box to the left of each item that is applicable. And then last but not least, the last part of the form is the grantee certification. Type the name and title of your authorized government official, and then have them email the form directly to the DNR. And a lot of times this will happen in concert with the submittal of the final reimbursement requests, which also typically comes from that authorized government official directly from their email account. And so just a friendly reminder again that your regional non-point source coordinator is your primary contact during project implementation. And so I'm sure all of you already know who that person is, but please keep in touch with the coordinator in your area about how your project is progressing, and especially if it's not progressing, what reasons and what challenges you may be up against. Better to let us know what's going on as early as possible rather than waiting when it's too late to do anything about modifying your grant or your project. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation and we'll open it up one last time for questions.
The only new question we had was about presentation being available online. And yes, this webinar was recorded, so we will be uploading it to YouTube and sharing that link with you in the next couple of days. Are there any other questions out there? All right. Well, thank you again, Corinne, for all the great information that you provided today. And thank you everyone for attending. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Yep, thank you, Whitney and Michelle, and thank you everybody again for participating in the webinar, and look forward to hearing from you and seeing those reimbursement requests coming in. Everybody take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.